Good afternoon, everybody, excellencies and distinguished guests. Before we start the program, I would request everybody to kindly switch off their mobile or put them in silent mode. Thank you. Excellencies and distinguished guests, on behalf of the Permanent Mission of India, I welcome all of you for joining us today at this special event to commemorate the 125th birth anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar here at the United Nations. We are privileged to have amongst us today Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark, Administrator of United Nations Development Programme, His Excellency Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, Permanent Representative of India, His Excellency Mr. Charanjit Atwal, Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Padma Shri Kalpana Saroj of Kalpana Saroj Foundation, and Mr. Dilip Mahaske, President of Foundation for Human Horizon, on the dais with us. Now, with the start of the program, I request Permanent Representative of India, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, to kindly deliver the welcome remarks. Ambassador, please. Thank you.
Helen Clark, Administrator, UNDP, Mr. Charanjit Singh Atwal, the Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Ms. Kalpana Saroj of the Kalpana Saroj Foundation, Mr. Dilip Maske, President of the Foundation of Human Horizon, ladies and gentlemen, it is for me personally an honor and a privilege to welcome you to this seminal event at the United Nations. Observing the birth centenary of Dr. Bheem Ramji Ambedkar is now somewhat of a tradition in modern India. He was the principal architect of the Indian Constitution and independent India's first law minister, a social reformer, a jurist, economist, an author, and a scholar of comparative religions. In short, he was a multifaceted personality who braved the walls of prejudice and discrimination in early 20th century India to emerge as an exemplar and an unflinching crusader against the social inequities and economic deprivation that afflicted millions of Indians then. This year, thanks to the support of civil society advocacy groups, such as those led by Ms. Kalpana Saroj, a woman entrepreneur whose life story is itself remarkable in many ways, and the Foundation of Human Horizons, led by the young activist Mr. Dilip Maske, we've taken a leap of faith. For the first time, we have ventured to host an event at the United Nations. We do this based on the thinking that it is best put in Dr. Ambedkar's own words, and I quote, "Men are mortal, so are ideas. An idea needs propagation as much as a plant needs watering. Otherwise, both will wither and die." Today, we have gathered to recall both Dr. Ambedkar the man and his ideas. He was, for all of us, a modern-day giant whose life and philosophy is a profile in courage and conviction. A reformer who strives in the league of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela as a champion of the downtrodden and a conscience keeper. Last year, when the United Nations adopted the Universal and Transformative Agenda 2030 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets, we as Indians noticed traces of Dr. Ambedkar's vision in the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me try and provide some examples of how we see these linkages. reducing inequality is both a standalone goal of the Sustainable Development Goal number 10 and a cross-cutting issue across all Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Ambedkar fashioned a pluralistic and inclusive Indian Constitution guaranteeing equal opportunity and freedom of expression and faith for all citizens in a secular democracy. The Constitution drafted under his leadership abolished untouchability, outlawed all forms of discrimination. Yet, Dr. Ambedkar himself also recognized that the quest for substantive equality and justice would remain a work in progress. As he said, and I quote, "In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions?" This need to combat inequalities both within and among countries remains our quest even today, as reflected in Agenda 2030. Let me give you another example of the commonality of vision. This relates to Goal 5 of the SDGs, which aims at achieving gender equality as crucial to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Dr. Ambedkar's political vocabulary was one of gender empowerment and is best summarized in his statement, and I quote, "I measure the progress of a community by the degree of progress which women have achieved." These were words spoken more than a century ago. Pursuing this, Dr. Ambedkar provided for special provisions for women's equality, both in formal and sustainable senses in India's Constitution. While other provisions of the Constitutions are applicable to women as to men, there are also provisions in our Constitution that enable affirmative action in favor of women to ensure that no one is left behind, a key message of Agenda 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, as a historian of an earlier generation once put it, India embraces in its orbit beliefs, customs, rights, institutions, arts, religion, and philosophies belonging to different strata of societies in varying degrees of development. It eternally seeks to find a unity for the heterogeneous elements which make up its totality. A thought that our Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, has summarized in his clarion call, "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas," meaning together with all, development for all. It is in this spirit that we have today approached the keynote speaker and other panelists, including from Dr. Ambedkar's alma mater, Columbia University. We are deeply appreciative of their willingness to join us here. With these introductory remarks, I am pleased to invite Ms. Helen Clark to make her keynote statement. As you are aware, Ms. Clark is the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and is the chair of the United Nations Development Group. The United Nations Development Programme plays a crucial role in helping developing countries in their efforts to implement Agenda 2030 and achieve sustainable development. Ms. Clark, those of you who have followed her are aware, has served as the Prime Minister of New Zealand for 3 terms. During her career in public service, she has widely engaged in policy development and advocacy across economic, social, and cultural spheres. In many ways, she has championed the cause for a fairer and better world. We are grateful to her for sparing the time to share her thoughts with us today on issues relating to combating inequalities for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. Madam, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Kalpana Saroj, Dilip Mahaske, Excellencies, and all who've come to join this celebration of Dr. Ambedkar's life. And thank you, Ambassador, for inviting me to deliver the keynote speech this afternoon. Well, we are talking about the legacy of a very great man, a founding father of the Constitution of India, and a man who understood that rising and persistent inequalities will pose fundamental challenges to the economic and social well-being of nations and people. His work on the empowerment and inclusion of excluded groups, on the reform of the labour laws of India, and the promotion of education for all made him an icon for the poor and marginalised people in India and in other countries. The ideals for which he worked so hard are as relevant today as they were when the Indian Constitution was signed into law. Reducing inequalities and discrimination in all their forms is at the very heart of the new global development agenda, which world leaders here in this very building at the United Nations in New York signed onto last September. And that pledge to leave no one behind is at the cornerstone of the new agenda and of the Sustainable Development Goals. It calls on countries at every stage of development to reduce inequalities by tackling the wide disparities between rich and poor, known in many countries. A UNDP study 2 years ago found that in 3/4 of all developing countries, income is more unequally distributed now than it was in 1990, when the Millennium Development Goals baseline was. And it's also important to tackle those biases which are found across, in many places, institutions, legal systems, social norms. These are the drivers of discrimination and inequality. When groups of people are not able to fully access resources, markets, basic services like health and education, and the forums through which their voices can be heard in decision-making processes, the result is entrenched inequality. And this is the situation faced by disadvantaged groups in many countries, whether they be poor, women, rural populations, urban slum populations, marginalised, indigenous communities, or ethnic or other minorities. So our world has work to do. What will it take to achieve the vision of the man whose life we honour today? Well, Dr. Ambedkar had a deep understanding of the far-reaching measures which are needed to reduce inequalities. Today, as when he lived and wrote, all countries have work to do. Let's start with promoting inclusive and sustainable growth, which will generate the decent work needed to address inequalities. The benefits of growth need to be shared across the society. And this calls for economic and social policies which will prioritise lifting the incomes and circumstances of the poor and marginalised at a higher rate than the national average. Then there is the importance of governance, which is responding to the needs of the poorest and most marginalised. This is critical for tackling inequalities. And so for UNDP, building the capacity of governments at the national level and the subnational level and other stakeholders to address the social determinants of inequalities is a central part of our work. And we are partners with many governments in implementing, for example, social and environmental safeguards and grievance mechanisms, and in seeing that communities can have a voice in the decision-making which has an impact on their lives. Giving top priority to leaving no one behind and to poverty eradication are guiding principles for development around the world in the new global agenda. And to eradicate poverty, it is imperative to address inequality in all its dimensions. On behalf of UNDP, I commend India on celebrating this important anniversary here at the United Nations. We are committed to continuing our very close partnership with India to help realise the vision of the 2030 Agenda and ensure that Dr. Ambedkar's vision becomes reality for the poor and marginalised around our world. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for sharing with us your insightful and fascinating keynote address. Allow me now to invite President of Foundation for Human Horizon, Mr. Dilip Mahaske, to deliver his remarks. Mr. Dilip, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayank. Jai Bhim all. This is the first time Jai Bhim World will be heard in this big democratic platform. It's been years and years we have been dreaming about this, and we did, with the help of Prime Minister Modi ji and Indian government, they help us to organize this event. His Excellencies, Sir Syed Akbaruddin ji, Madam Helen Clark, Padam Shri Kalpana Saroj ji, Speaker Atwal ji, Jai Bhim again. Ladies and gentlemen, words can hardly do justice to the greatness of the man whose life we have assembled to celebrate here. To compare a great man is to belittle the currents of history. However, to contextualize Ambedkar, I can think of no other than the biblical figures of Moses, mentor of the dispossessed, broken Jews, leading them through the scourging Sinai and crossing the Red Sea out of the sheer willpower. Further down, we find Jesus of Nazareth, infusing life into the dead Lazarus, curing lepers by mere touch, making his simple disciplines reach the pinnacle of exertion to the lay foundation of Catholic Church, the longest surviving institution in the world has ever seen. We see Jefferson initiating the American ideal of all men being created equal, and Abraham Lincoln's proclaiming the abolition of slavery. Ambedkar was, in a way, both Moses and Jesus, both Jefferson and Lincoln. No Ramesses, no Pharaoh could obstruct his march to freedom, nor could any Pontius Pilate prevent him to infuse life into the moribund, half-dead community living on the margins of social edifice. He walked with the great John Davy, under the portals of Columbia in New York, absorbing the ideas of equality, social improvement, and inherent obligation of the state to ensure justice and equity to the least. The radiance of Jefferson and Lincoln enlightened the gathering of lawmakers when Ambedkar presented the draft for the humanity. We bow our heads to honor such a man today. His scholarly output, his enlightened legacy, and ever-growing progeny emerging from the dark shadows of untouchability are legendary. He bequeathed the gift of education with the emphasis of relentless struggles towards excellency. India's emergence today on the global scene is but the outcome of this uncompromising quest for education and exertion. His political sagacity lay in the finances of the art compromise. Short-sighted commentators have questioned his patriotism, his scholarships, his sagacity, but if the fruits are the taste of the tree's worth, his exertions were but showing the best man plant to reap the healthiest of the fruit. Mother India is proud of her great son, who wiped the dust of obstructionism and isolation, denial, and recreative from her consciousness and brought back the wisdom of her most enlightened son, the Buddha, in her spiritual and intellectual development. In New York, in the form of United Nations today, laid the foundation for this great experiment. So we have all assembled here today to commemorate that great life. Thank you for this opportunity, and Jai Bhim again.
Thank you, Mr. Dilip, for sharing your valuable remarks. Excellencies and distinguished guests, today on the eve of Ambedkar Jayanti, the life and message of Baba Saheb Dr. Ambedkar is more than relevant. We all know of his monumental work towards the society, and we must continue to remember his message. What we have arranged is a short 14-minute movie clip edited from a documentary prepared by the Films Division of India on the life of Baba Saheb Dr. Ambedkar. Can we have the movie, please?
There cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than Chaturvarnya. It is the system which deadens, paralyzes, and cripples the people from helpful activity. There came a man who gave his life to lift them up from the darkness of millennia-old social brutality and injustice, who gave them dignity, self-respect, and a will to fight for their human rights. His decrepit ancestral home at Ambedkar in coastal Kolaba district of Maharashtra and the stark locality and silent tombs of his ancestors at nearby Dapoli may have a story to tell. Legend has it that a spiritual ancestor blessed Ramji and his wife Bheema that they will bear a son who will brighten the dark horizon of his people. The son, Bheemrao, was thus born on 14th April 1891 in the military colony of Mhau in Madhya Pradesh, his father being a Subedar major in the Indian Army. Bheemrao spent his childhood at Dapoli. His family shifted to Satara, where he lost his mother.
जो बिछुड़े हैं प्यारे से.
He was thus brought up under the loving care of his paternal aunt, Mirabai. It is not difficult to imagine how the young Ambedkar's sensitive mind reacted to the treatment the untouchables were given. In school, the teachers were kind and compassionate. One of the Brahmin teachers was fond of young Bheem and was so impressed by his intellect that he lent his own name to the young student. And thus, Bheemrao Ambedkar became Bheemrao Ambedkar. Nevertheless, caste discrimination was galore. Young Bheem pursued his studies diligently, often sleeping in the company of goats, reading in public parks and under street lamps. Ambedkar was married immediately after his success in the matriculation examination in the Baikala public vegetable market. The age of the groom, 17 years, and the bride Ramai, 9 years. After graduation, he served the progressive-minded Maharaja of Baroda, Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, who provided Ambedkar with a scholarship to go abroad. Then on to the United States of America, the land of liberty and equality, the land of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, to pursue higher studies. Columbia University, New York. Ambedkar had a passion for knowledge and an obsession with books. Above all, he knew he must study hard to fight his battles back at home. Eleanor Zelliot, a noted scholar of Ambedkar's writings and Dalit literature, says,
1913-1916 were Columbia's glory days. It was the most distinguished center of learning, I think, in America. He studied with many distinguished teachers. Perhaps the most famous is John Dewey, America's best-known educator. Pragmatic, in love with democracy, a world traveler, Ambedkar remembered John Dewey all his life, and at the end of his life, used to imitate his teaching style.
From USA to the London School of Economics for advanced studies, and also putting in terms at Gray's Inn for law. But his scholarship remuneration had run out. Despite his efforts, Ambedkar had to go back and serve Baroda state on the insistence of the state's Diwan. So humiliating was the treatment meted out by the high caste staff to this senior official of the Baroda state that Ambedkar returned to Bombay disgusted. A brief stint as a lecturer in Bombay's Sydenham College, and then this unusual young man of learning who had launched a crusade against the system of caste, attracted the attention of Shahu Maharaj of Kolhapur, himself a reformist prince who worked hard to break the hold of Brahmin priests on society and emancipate the downtrodden. In 1920, that Dr. Ambedkar, under the patronage of Shahu Maharaj, launched a fortnightly to articulate the anguish of his depressed community. The journal was appropriately titled Mook Nayak, the Dumb Hero. After all, Dr. Ambedkar was the greatest follower of Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, that outstanding man who championed the cause of women and the depressed in the 19th century. Soon, the prince offered him a scholarship to complete his discontinued studies in London, and Dr. Ambedkar set sail for England in July 1920. Ambedkar returned home in April 1923 before the degree of Doctor of Science was awarded to him. A great reception awaited the young man. From then on, while practicing law in the Bombay High Court, he plunged headlong into his life's mission to uplift the untouchables, to educate them. To achieve these goals, his first organizational attempt was the establishment of the Bahishkrita Hitkarani Sabha, an organization for the welfare of outcasts. In 1926, he was nominated by the governor to the Bombay Legislative Council. As a conscientious legislator, Ambedkar applied his erudition and legal knowledge to champion the causes of the lowly and the poor. His fame began to spread far and wide. Young intellectuals from the depressed classes began gathering around him. Dr. Ambedkar was invited to the Round Table Conference in London in September 1930 as a representative of the depressed classes. The objective of the conference, held at the historic St. James Palace, was to frame a constitution for India by taking into account the views of various sections of people. Dr. Ambedkar pleaded at the conference that the bureaucratic form of government in India should be replaced by a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In all the 3 rounds of the Round Table Conference, in the plenary sessions, in committee and in subcommittee meetings, Dr. Ambedkar used all his erudition and skill to champion 2 causes: India's freedom and safety, and the protection of the depressed in a free and democratic India. He was elected to the Bombay Legislative Assembly in the first general elections of 1935 as an independent Labour Party candidate. He gave deep thought to the plight of the working class, even as he organized workers' trade unions. He spoke on the finances of the state and the nation. Agrarian problems, such as the consolidation of small holdings, attracted his studied comments.
He seemed very keen on that. He also told me he wanted to establish a minimum wage for workers. If I tell you that it was many years later that the British Labour Party embarked upon such a scheme, you'll see how advanced he was and his thoughts.
Education, in his view, was the major weapon to fight social evils. His long-cherished dream was fulfilled when he founded the People's Education Society and started Siddharth College at Bombay in June 1946, and later the Milind Mahavidyalaya, Aurangabad. He had a mission to fulfill. Destiny awaited him in Delhi. In July 1942, Dr. Ambedkar was invited to join the Viceroy's Executive Council as a Labour member. Dr. Ambedkar was elected to the Constituent Assembly of India in October 1946. His outstanding moment came when he was elected and made chairman of the committee to draft the Constitution. I know that today we are divided politically, socially, and economically. We are in warring camps, and I am probably the leader of one of the warring camps. But with all this, I am convinced that given time and circumstances, nothing in the world will prevent this country from becoming one. And with all our castes and creeds, I have not the slightest hesitation in saying that we shall in some form be a united people. Dr. Ambedkar, besides becoming the law minister in the interim government of Free India, was ordained to become the principal architect of the Constitution of India. The happiest person was Mahatma Gandhi. It was a proud moment for India, he told Ambedkar himself, that the former downtrodden had become the lawmaker of Free India. Ambedkar's extensive knowledge of world history, his profound commitment to the universal democratic principles, and concern for safeguarding the human and political rights of the minorities went into the monumental work of drafting the document. His reply in the House on the prolonged discussion of the draft is considered among the remarkable speeches in India's parliamentary history. When the Constituent Assembly, in the name of the people of India, adopted the Constitution with its 395 articles and 8 schedules on November 26, 1949, no less than Dr. Rajendra Prasad, President of the Constituent Assembly, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of the interim government, paid glowing tributes to Dr. Ambedkar. Ambedkar, in 1935, he had made a pledge that he would not die a Hindu. 20 years had passed. His health was failing. It was time to fulfill the pledge. Dr. Ambedkar's embracing Buddhism was an epoch-making event. Nearly 1 million untouchables accompanied Dr. Ambedkar on his new path. But more important than the numbers, the grand Diksha ceremony symbolized the denouncement of the Hindu caste system and the pernicious practice of untouchability.
His personal secretary, Nanak Chand Rattu, says,
early in the morning, the servant and the driver, they came to my place, knocked the door. As soon as I opened, I was surprised to see their faces. I took it that something must have happened. I immediately inquired, is Baba Sahib all right? But they did not have. They only said that Mem Sahib had sent them to call you. So immediately I started. Read 26 Haripur Road. Mr. Ambedkar was sitting in the veranda waiting for me. Immediately I got out of the car. He took me inside and told me that Baba Sahib has left us.
Thus ended on December 6, 1956, the great journey of one of the tallest sons of India.
जो बिछुड़े हैं प्यारे से भटकते दर बदर फिर.
A fierce social rebel and yet a compassionate reformist. A proud nationalist who would not compromise on the rights of the downtrodden. An iconoclast who believed in the necessity of religion. A champion of women and the minorities. The last outstanding leader In the glorious chain of social reformers Maharashtra has produced, Ranade, Phule, Agarkar, and Ambedkar. The great son of India who gave self-respect and political rights to the millions of untouchables of India.
Thank you for your kind attention. With this, we come to the closing of the opening session. On behalf of the Government of India and all distinguished guests present here among us today, I thank Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark for having taken out the time from her extremely busy schedule and joining us at this special event to commemorate the 125th anniversary of Baba Saheb Dr. Ambedkar. I thank you, Excellency. Now we move to the next segment of the program, that is the panel discussion. And I would request the distinguished dignitaries on the dais to kindly take their places on the floor. I also invite the panelists, Mr. Stan Kachnowski, Chair, HIT Lab, Ms. Anupama Rao, Associate Professor in Columbia University, and Mr. Christopher Quinn from Harvard University to kindly take their place on the dais. Please. The panel discussion will be moderated by Mr. Dilip Mahaske, President of Foundation for Human Horizon. The topic of the panel discussion, the theme of today's panel discussion is combating inequalities for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. Now I give the floor to Mr. Dilip Mahaske. Thank you.
Do you need to have any particular pattern, or you can go whatever? You want to go woman first, and then woman first? I said woman. Welcome to all panelists here. Professor Anupama Rao from Columbia, Bernard University, is a part of Columbia University. Yep. Stan Kachnowski, thank you for joining in the last moment. As soon as he heard about this panel discussion, he was very, very enthusiastic, and he just said yes. Thank you very much. And Christopher King, Professor Christopher King, you have been a part of our ongoing discussion for a long time, so thank you for joining today. So today we are going to start with the combating inequalities for the achieving SDGs. And we would like to start with the First Lady here on the dais, Professor Anupama Rao. Floor is yours.
Jai Bheem. It's a very great honor to be here today at this historic commemoration of B.R. Ambedkar by the United Nations on the occasion of his 125th birth anniversary. I teach at Columbia, the university where B.R. Ambedkar studied between 1913 and 1916. And I believe that Ambedkar is among the great thinkers of the 20th century because he has made signal contributions to constitutional law and democratic theory that require global engagement. So it's indeed a very great privilege to be here with you today. Official commemoration of Ambedkar has been belated, perhaps because his contribution to questions of social justice, minority rights, and economic equity were far ahead of their time. Ambedkar wanted an enduring social democracy, while those around him were largely focused on political independence for India from the British. Western thinkers themselves have long argued that substantive equality is a slow and gradual process, which follows from the granting of political rights. In fact, many of them have argued that economic rights are the final frontier in the struggle for human rights more generally. Instead, Ambedkar, from the very start, conceived rights capaciously as both individual and group rights, and by linking human flourishing with sustainable livelihood. Thus, Ambedkar's commitments to affirmative action, a strong legal framework, and redistributive justice are relevant. Indeed, they anticipate the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I'd like to begin by reminding you that Ambedkar had a long relationship with the UN from its very inception. And this has helped to globalize the Dalit issue today. In July of 1946, he corresponded with the African-American thinker W.E.B. Du Bois about the petition of the National Negro Congress to the UN Council seeking minority rights for them. Ambedkar wanted to use this petition as a template for positioning caste discrimination and inequality in a similar way. As you know, the CERD, the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, was created in 1968. And in 1982, Dr. Lakshmi Berwa became the first Dalit to testify before the UN Commission on Human Rights. And he testified again in 1995 about the plight of Dalits before the UN. In 1996, the CERD committee recognized that the situation of the scheduled castes and tribes fell within its scope, and this aided demands at the Durban World Conference Against Racism in 2001 to recognize the practice of untouchability as a form of racism. More recent efforts, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, to legislate caste discrimination within South Asian communities follows from these key openings provided by the UN with regard to minority rights. This suggests more broadly yet ongoing links between Ambedkar and the United Nations, which connects social justice with global institutions, and increasingly with the question of sustainable livelihood and environmental responsibility. Let's turn now to think more specifically about Ambedkar's own contributions to comparative justice. Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution and played a key role in supporting social justice measures within that committee, though he was often also stymied in those efforts. For example, during the debate on the third draft constitution in 1949, he argued, "On 26 January, we are going to enter a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy, which this assembly has laboriously built up." And he was not above rejecting the document he had helped to author, such as when he argued later, if our people want to carry on, they must remember that the majorities cannot ignore the minorities by saying, "Oh no, to recognize you is to harm democracy." And indeed, it is this critical distance and Ambedkar's ceaseless efforts to close the gap between policy and process, which also allowed the Constituent Assembly to produce a document that has been described by one of the leading historians of the Indian Constitution as enabling a peaceful social revolution. Article 617 of India's Constitution abolished the practice of untouchability. This is akin to a general ban on the practice of racism or sexism, which is extremely difficult to implement. This abolition of untouchability acknowledged the historic injustice of caste and connected human rights with a robust regime of legal protections and affirmative action entitlements. That is, there was a recognition from the start that human rights can only be secured through a strong commitment to redistribution of resources and of social opportunities. Scholars have noted two things about India's constitution, which relates to Ambedkar's own signal efforts to use the plight of Dalits as the occasion to think more expansively about social dignity, economic rights, and political equality. First is the constitutional commitment to affirmative action for vulnerable groups, which is absolute and which trumps commitments to formal equality. This is quite radical, and it's quite different from even the affirmative action provisions of the US Constitution, where affirmative action must constantly be balanced with the Equal Protection Clause. Second, the Indian Constitution seeks to balance group rights against individual liberties. Again, this secures the collective rights of minorities who are often targeted en masse or who suffer discrimination due to group identity. This has strong resonance again with UN efforts to protect cultural and linguistic rights and to recognize racism as a collective harm. It's against this backdrop that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which recognizes sustainable livelihoods and economic rights as key to the human rights agenda, becomes significant. Much needs to be done. Anti-Dalit atrocities are on the rise, and this violence targets symbols of upward mobility and signs of social and economic empowerment. Silent forms of prejudice and discrimination persist, including obstacles to housing and employment. Dalit capitalization continues to be a very major problem. Dalit-owned businesses are rare and face enormous hurdles. And we are indeed deeply, deeply honored to have Kalpana Saroj here with us today. Recently, elite educational institutions such as the IITs and the central universities have become important sites for Dalit student protest. Many of you here are surely aware of the tragic death by suicide of Rohit Vemula, whose note spoke of targeted exclusion before he died. Yet, violence and inequality can no longer take place in secrecy, and this is indeed the great, great contribution of the constitutional regime in India. The challenge to caste hegemony is strong and ongoing, including by government, NGOs, civil society organizations, and strong individuals. And most of all, this happens through an ethical challenge that all of us must confront about our relationship to historical privilege and our responsibility to a future where caste indeed can be annihilated, as Ambedkar demanded in his famous 1936 book, The Annihilation of Caste. I think this is the world that Ambedkar would have wanted to live in were he alive today. Jai Bheem, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rao. This is, if there were no affirmative actions, I would have not be sitting here in front of this panel. If there was no government involvement in my life, I would have not been sitting here. So it plays balance. Government has a responsibility, and it has been fulfilling their responsibilities, but it needs to be done more and more and more. So on this note, I would like to invite Professor Christopher Quinn. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Jai Bheem. It's such a pleasure to say Jai Bheem here in the United Nations. Jai Bheem. And I want to offer warm thanks to Dilip Maske for his role in setting up this amazing gathering for us. He compared Babasaheb Ambedkar to Moses, Jesus, Jefferson, and Lincoln, and I'd like to spend just a few moments with you comparing Dr. Ambedkar's career with that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who many of us here also recognize as a great liberator. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather here at the UN today to honor the memory of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, India's most fearless and eloquent voice for equality. This year, 2016, is a fitting time to revisit Ambedkar's lifelong struggle
for Dalit human rights and to place it alongside the struggles of other marginalized people in the world today. For 2016 marks the 125th anniversary of Ambedkar's birth and the 60th anniversary of his death. It also recalls a landmark victory at the beginning of America's civil rights movement. 60 years ago, Dr. Ambedkar launched the largest mass Buddhist conversion in history, identifying the ancient teaching of Dharma with the struggle for human rights and the abolition of caste in India. Ambedkar chose Buddhism as a philosophy of nonviolent social change that sees each person as precious and equal. He chose the date October 14th to lead 500,000 ex-untouchables into Buddhism because that date is associated with the Buddhist conversion of India's greatest king. Ashoka Maurya's armies had subdued most of South Asia in the 3rd century BCE through violent conquest. But then he had a profound change of heart, and henceforth he ruled his empire by Dharma Vijaya, a policy of tolerance and equal protection of all citizens under law. While Ambedkar and his followers embraced Ashoka's legacy in 1956, the American civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., won his first victory in the U.S. Supreme Court, ending the Montgomery bus boycott and establishing the principle of equality for African Americans on public transportation. In the 6 decades that have passed since then, the followers of Ambedkar and King have won many victories. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, the youngest man to receive this award, and Ambedkar was awarded the Bharat Ratna, India's highest civilian award, in 1990, 34 years after his death. Sadly, these honors do not mark the achievement of equality for tens of millions of Dalits, OBCs, and tribal citizens in India who still suffer the world's highest rates of poverty and violence, or for blacks in the United States who are subject to daily violence in the streets, systematic discrimination in the workplace, and the highest rates of incarceration of any group in the world. Nor are the legacies of Ambedkar and King equally revered around the world. Ambedkar, one of the most outspoken and visible founding fathers of the Indian Republic, remains virtually unknown outside of India. Most people know that Mahatma Gandhi led the fight for independence and that his nonviolent marches inspired Dr. King and the American Civil Rights Movement. But few people know of Ambedkar, the first untouchable to attend college, the first to earn advanced degrees in New York and London, to pass the bar and launch mass movements for access to public drinking water and temple worship, the first appointed law minister of India, and the principal author of its constitution, and the first modern politician to embrace mass religious conversion as a means to social transformation. At the same time, Ambedkar was not alone in demanding social justice in the name of religious truth and morality. Martin Luther King Jr. was a 27-year-old preacher and a doctoral student when the bus boycott he led ended up in the Supreme Court. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, to a Baptist minister, Martin earned distinction in college and seminary and was himself ordained a minister at the age of 19. Still hungry for education, he went on to earn his doctorate in philosophy and theology at Boston University. Like Ambedkar, King quickly applied his education to the service of his people. At 28, he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and addressed a crowd of 15,000 in Washington, D.C. The following year, Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act, and King published his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. At that age, Ambedkar had also published his first book titled Castes in India. Both young activists were hailed as the new leaders of an age-old struggle. King led nonviolent protests and sit-ins to integrate public accommodations. He was stabbed, beaten by police, jailed, and spied on by the FBI. Nevertheless, in June 1963, he led 125,000 marchers on the Freedom Walk through Detroit, followed in August that year by the historic rally of 250,000 people on the Washington Mall, where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. There are many parallels between the anti-caste movement in early 20th century India and the civil rights movement in the U.S. since the 1950s. Although caste and race are different, one, artificial ranking of human worth based on social restrictions, and the other on history and physical appearance, the struggle against prejudice, privilege, and power have taken similar forms in the two democracies. Ambedkar and King both experienced discrimination while growing up. As a boy, King was best friends with a white boy from across the street. But one day, his friend's parents announced that he was no longer welcome to play with their son. "We are white and you are colored," they told him. His mother tried to soothe his wounded feelings by saying, "You must never feel that you are less than anybody else. You must always feel that you are somebody." In the coming years, King learned that not all whites were devils. Ambedkar suffered endless humiliations as a boy growing up in India, as many of you know. But like King, he also attracted and valued the support of powerful allies. The princes of Baroda and Kolhapur recognized the young untouchable's brilliance and paid his tuitions in Elphinstone College, Columbia University, and the London School of Economics. And Ambedkar's appointment as India's first law minister could not have occurred without the support of high-caste Hindus like Gandhi and Nehru. After seeing the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, King was fatally shot in 1968. The anguish of the nation was marked by violent street demonstrations across America. 12 years earlier, millions of Dalits had poured peacefully into the streets of Mumbai and across India to bid farewell to their leader, as we just saw those amazing photos in the film clip. Today, the struggle for Dalit rights in India and the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. remind us of the battles of Ambedkar and King. The old questions remain. How can we create societies of equality, freedom, and brotherhood? How can we reach out beyond barriers of caste, class, race, and religion to forge alliances of peace and justice? These questions are compounded by developments that have made the 21st century more complicated and more dangerous. We're witnessing an inexorable loss of safety and privacy in the fight against global terrorism. We're contributing relentlessly, despite the heroic efforts of some, to the climate change that threatens the life support systems on which we depend. We take pride in the global reach of information technologies that nevertheless blind and addict users to realities that are virtual and not real. And the theme of this panel, we stand by as vast inequalities of income, opportunity, and human rights mushroom in countries both rich and poor. In the decades since 1956, even the U.S. Supreme Court has changed for the worst. Corporations are now considered people. Money is considered speech, all protected by a constitution that Ambedkar and King both believed in. In India, liberal voices and those critical of the status quo face death. M.M. Kalburgi, the 77-year-old scholar and critic of Hindu idol worship, was gunned down on his doorstep last August. Govind Pansari, the communist leader, was killed last year in Mumbai. And today, India is racked with demonstrations over caste violence in higher education following the tragic death of Rohit Vemula, a PhD student attempting to live by Dr. Ambedkar's philosophy of nonviolent social change. If Ambedkar and King were alive today, we can be sure that each leader would address himself to these challenges. King did not confine himself to the fight for racial justice, but came out against the war in Vietnam and fought for economic justice. Ambedkar refused to be pigeonholed as a politician. He, too, was a scholar, a teacher, an activist, and a spiritual leader. I would like to close with a quote from Dr. Ambedkar's career that many of you will recognize, one of my favorite quotes. Addressing 70,000 of his followers in Nagpur in 1942, he may have anticipated his conversion there 14 years later as he connected the struggle for equality with the need for personal courage. My final words of advice to you is educate, agitate, and organize. Have faith in yourself. With justice on our side, I do not see how we can lose our battle. The battle for me is a matter of joy. It is in the fullest sense spiritual. There is nothing material or social in it, for ours is a battle not for wealth or power. It's a battle for freedom. It's a battle for the reclamation of human personality. When a leader uses the word battle 6 times in a single breath, without implying that his audience should take up arms or threaten the safety of others, We may experience the passion and conviction that drove leaders like Ambedkar and King to sacrifice their lives for a cause. But we may also feel challenged to consider the roles each of us might play to achieve universal equality and the other sustainable development goals that member states, ambassadors, and activists here at the United Nations seek for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Quinn. That's what we need to have global dialogue, comparing all the marginalized section leaders, fighting for the humanity, fighting for the global peace and justice. Working towards justice, these are the platforms like Indian government has created that we need to discuss and work towards that. So your advice and Babasaheb Ambedkar's advice, educate, agitate, and organize. That's what we have to learn. For any discrimination all over the world, there are issues all over the world, but these are the key principles for humanity, and hope when people go out of this room, they work towards it. They at least take something from it. Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. Now, we heard a lot of talk about social justice. We had a lot of talk about equality, justice, liberty, but without talk about economy, without talk about innovation, without bringing economy and money inside, it's not a complete development. Now, next speaker, who is extremely educated in innovations, known for his innovations in Colombia for high-tech lab, Professor Stan Kosmowski. Please, this is yours, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. What I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about my background first, to give you an idea of why I'm here, and then also to then talk about India's role in Sustainable Development Goals and how Dr. Ambedkar was such a key element in forming what is now really the medical technology supplier to the world. And I think when you look at the convergence of his elements, of his principles, of healthcare, of education, colliding together, and then looking at the healthcare technology system that India not only has in place today, but is in fact the world leader, particularly in pharmaceuticals, supplying 90% of the world's countries outside of about 20 or so with their drugs and medical supplies. And this extraordinary influence is something that I see, and I'll go back to my background. I teach in India. I've been teaching there for the past 15 years. As a matter of fact, I call Delhi my second home. I've been a visiting professor at IIT Delhi, teaching healthcare informatics and biomedical informatics, and have been working to help also with the eradication of tuberculosis in India using mobile technology tools. How many people in this room have mobile phones on them right now? Okay, so there's either half of you are sleeping or you're really far behind the times here, and I've traveled back into the 20th century. So I think that what we have in front of us is a world of 7.5 billion people, and about 6 billion people have smartphones, cell phones, and about 1.5 billion have smartphones. So we're looking at a time where healthcare equity globally is within our reach. And in a poll that the Times of India did about 2 years ago with women living in homes in Delhi without foundations, they asked, what would you rather have, a mobile phone or a toilet? 90% of the women said mobile phones. And this is, in essence, this is where we are, historically speaking, in terms of India changing the course of world history and where we're moving, in terms of India not only being the leader in pharmaceutical technologies, but also informatics and biomedical informatics technologies, whether we're talking about electronic health record systems, these new devices that we're wearing all the time called wearables and fitness trackers, or algorithms and new ways of looking at how to gather vast amounts of healthcare data and actually help populations. So the Dalits and the others in India that are in need of vaccines, or trying to find them, trying to get to them, or in need of tuberculosis treatment and the follow-on treatment that is required for tuberculosis. 6 months of large pills twice a day, when many of those communities are living from place to place and not in a stable home situation. So I think let's take a look at the history of India's role in medical technology and how Dr. Ambedkar was such a pivotal role in that, not only for the importance of healthcare in the Indian ecosystem, but also education. So look back at this in a moment and look at, first of all, smallpox, right? Smallpox killed nearly 4.7 million people a year in India at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. And when you look at the devastation that smallpox wreaked across the world, roughly 300 million people died of smallpox in the 20th century. And this is a perfect place for us to begin to look at his relevance and his importance in terms of India and the World Health Organization, because it was a combination of the resources around India and the World Health Organization, which formed a task force to eradicate smallpox in 1966. Remember now, there was a treatment and a vaccine for smallpox in 1796. So it took a little while. But at the end of the day, when you had global superpowers like those countries in the West and then the Soviet Union producing these vaccinations for either at cost or way below cost, and you had all of the public health workers in India working in large part because they saw this society that was envisioned by Dr. Ambedkar and looked at the opportunity to change society forever for the good by going out into villages and identifying and quarantining and vaccinating literally tens and tens of millions of Indians from 1966 until 1977, when India was certified smallpox-free. And only 2 years later, the globe was certified smallpox-free. And again, many of those were then produced in India as well. So let's fast forward now to the Sustainable Development Goals here at the United Nations, and let's look at the convergence again of his principles around education and healthcare, and look at the fact that India is the intellectual capital of the world in medical technology and is now exporting medical technologies all over the world. And then let's look at in 2005, the New York Times called on the need for India to be able to mass produce HIV medications within the generic system in order to have more health equity for people with HIV in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America. And it was, in essence, an editorial from the New York Times in 2005 that called upon the governments around the world to not prohibit India from being able to mass produce those HIV/AIDS treatments, and so that the world could be treated in that manner. So think now on this single individual's record of impact, not just in India, but within the global healthcare system. And think now at where we're going today with the attempts to eradicate tuberculosis, with other attempts around improving vaccination rates from 30% to 90%, with the attempts to improve the distribution and the diffusion of clean water technologies, of mosquito netting, and other technologies and medical supplies that can actually reduce infant mortality rates at an extraordinary rate. And it is really extraordinary to see that the impact of one man so many years ago would have such global ramifications. And that's why when Dilip was talking about my jumping at the opportunity to talk about something that converges healthcare and technology and Dr. Ambedkar's influence, and then the Sustainable Development Goals that many of us are trying to assist in achieving, it was something that I could not hesitate to offer and assist with. So again, thank you, Dilip. Thank you to the United Nations Permanent Mission in India for hosting this today. This is a wonderful meeting, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you, Professor Kostrovsky. This is the new dimension. Whenever we talk about Ambedkar, we talk about social justice, liberty, his work towards untouchability. It's very few times somebody like you can connect all the dots together. And his great contribution, he's beyond human rights, he's beyond just liberty, social equality. He was an economist, he was a jurist. He has so many dimensions in his own, he was like multiple person. Thank you for that, bringing that dimension, and hope in the future we can continue those type of dialogues, not just on the human rights issues, but bringing Ambedkar on the economic front too. And you have given that economic perspective, not just for the United Nations, but I think it's a new Ambedkar coming forward for new generation. Thank you for that, Professor Stan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dilip. Can I have the mic? Thank you. Yeah, it's fine. I thank the panelists for their profound insights into the life and message of Dr. Ambedkar, and also examining the needs for combating inequalities and achieving social justice in our efforts in the implementation of the Agenda 2030. Before we open the floor for an interactive discussion, I'm pleased to invite His Excellency, Mr. Charanjit Singh Atwal, Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly and the Chief Patron of Forum for Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Legislators and Parliamentarians, to share his message with this gathering today. His Excellency, Mr. Atwal, please. You invite to the lectern. Thank you.
Respected Madam Helen, Clerk Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Ambassador Mr. Syed Akbaruddin, Permanent Representative of India in the United Nations, Padma Shri Mrs. Kalpana Sarojji, and a member of her foundation, Mr. Dilip Maskeji, Director of the Foundation for Human Origins, Ms. Mayank Joshi, and Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. I am at loss of words to express my pleasure to be a part of this grand gala celebration of 125th birth anniversary of Baba Sahib Dr. Bheem Rao Ambedkar ji. The fact that the celebrations are taking place in this august institution, the headquarters of United Nations at New York, gives me all the more reason to feel proud and elated. Friends, I was elated to see the enthusiasm and excitement in the people of all ages when Honorable Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi ji, announced nationwide program to celebrate this day. Everybody came up with unique and beautiful ideas to commemorate their leaders. But I never expected that there is an extraordinary fervor among the general masses too for this great day. I am grateful to all who are responsible for this celebration. I thank everybody from the core of my heart, whether Indians or eminent persons of any nationality, who have contributed their bit to celebrate the day in honor of the great leader, who is acknowledged throughout the world and who have made the day this big. Friends, Dr. Ambedkar visualized the world from altogether different perspective. He viewed for the human dignity more than human freedom. To him, freedom is a state of mind, and he aptly quoted that freedom of mind is the real freedom. A person whose mind is not free, though he may not be in chain, is a slave. not a free man. One whose mind is not free, though he may not be in a prison. He is a prisoner and not a free man. One whose mind is not free, though alive, is no better than dead. Freedom of mind is a proof of one's existence. So may I please have the privilege to request the all lovers of Baba Sahib Bheem Rao Dr. Ambedkar ji to free their minds from the bondages of all sorts and follow his pug mark to lead a life of dignity and honor. Baba Sahib dedicated his life to sensitize the society towards the idea of mutual coexistence and creation of peaceful, respectful, and humane world. He was a great scholar and a reformer who carried on a struggle at different levels as such political, social, cultural, and intellectual in his pursuit to build a brave new society where all castes may enjoy equal status and dignity. He was not a fighting against any particular caste, but against casteism as such, which divides people and weakens the social fabric. Therefore, Ambedkar's ideologies necessitates annihilation of casteism and establishment of a very cordial social setup of mutuality. The great visionary always thought ahead of times, but the people realized it later. Baba Sahib held views which looked radical at that time, but they proved relevant with the passage of time and hold good even today in all the fields. But there always have been an attempt to belittle his significance by confining him almost entirely to the question of Dalit upliftment. It's true that Dalits were a crucial concern for him, but his contribution is no less significant in other spheres like economy, polity, secularism, and foreign relations, which needs to be realized by the non-Dalit society also. The Constitution of India is the best example to support this affirmation. The pioneering efforts of Dr. Ambedkar while drafting the Constitution were never backed by the thought of any caste or community specific. He uniquely contributed in providing to each and every individual of India the best constitution in the world, irrespective of caste, color, or creed. But sadly, the personality that belonged to every individual of our country is kept hooked to a specific society alone. What Baba Sahib conceived, his contemporaries were never able to even think of that. He was a man of values and always vied for the equality of social status for women, whom he always observed to be bound by the man dominance. He always considered women as a vital component in the socio-economic development in every society of the world. He measured the progress of a community by the degree of progress which women have achieved. This shows the intensity of his inclination towards the women empowerment. Baba Sahib was endowed with an intellectual vigor that is rarely seen in man. He embraced extraordinary knowledge and experience by virtue of his extraordinarily educational and professional qualification, which he acquired braving all the hardship and challenges during his lifetime. He is considered one of the most educated persons, not only among his contemporaries, but also among the scholars of present day with higher education like MA, PhD, MSc, DSc, Bharat Law, LLD, D.Lit degree to his credit. His writing and speeches amply reflect varied aspects of his multifaceted personality acquired under the circumstances where any person of resolve shorter than Baba Sahib would have been easily given up. Baba Sahib always said, do not believe in your fate, believe in your strength. He considered education as the surest way to give strength even to the weakest. That is why there is a persistent need to re-examine Baba Sahib thought in the context of changing socio, political, economic, and educational scenario of contemporary world. In my opinion, Baba Sahib has shown a very clear direction through the medium of his own life that education is such a virtue that makes all the problems look so small. It is such an asset that you give especially capacity to analyze the situation and come out with a solution no matter how big the challenge before you. So taking a lead from this thought, I would like to make a humble submission, humble request to all the dignitaries present here in this august house to contribute their bit in the elevating the standards of education in every area of their existence. Irrespective of the boundaries, that there be a collective drive to educate our children and let them write their own destinies with their own hands. Let there be a light of knowledge, flow of values, and evolutions of thought that Baba Sahib had dreamt. When and where I get a chance, I always try to sensitize the need of rural primary education, which is the foundation for the higher education for the children living in rural backward areas throughout the world. In addition, I would like to say that you cannot have a strong building on weak foundation. Any nation can become a great nation in the world until and unless it pays special attention to its primary education. Primary is the foundation stone for the development of a nation. There is huge disparity in the syllabus and curriculum of the government schools and private schools in the world. Children studying in the government schools in rural areas lag behind on various counts. The government schools in urban areas although have a better standing, but the level of vocational and extracurriculum activities in these schools too are not up to the mark as they appear in the private school. So always stress upon the need to bring all the government and private schools under the uniform pattern of syllabus and curriculum, so that the children going to any of these schools get the equal opportunity of education through the equal syllabus. There is a beautiful provision in our Constitution, right to education. We happily propagate this right, but forget a very important aspect as also, and we said by Baba Sahib that there is a need to give right education alongside the right to education to all the children of the world. Friends, Baba Sahib has been acknowledged as a man with unparalleled intellect, unmatched qualification. He brought an extraordinary enlightenment to the oppressed class of not only India, but also to the people of many other countries. That led famous US historian Woodward to remark that Ambedkar's description of the oppression of untouchable encouraged me to write about the oppression of blacks. Baba Sahib was the man with unique composure and temperament. Though trained as a liar, he became a leader by destiny for the cause that was to be the all-consuming passion of his life. In pursuit of this passion, emerged a social scientist, a free thinker, gifted writer, and a constitutionalist of eminence. But I seriously feel that apathy of the great men and saints has always been that their worth is acknowledged only after they leave this world. During lifetime, they are condemned and finally stoned and nailed to death. This was the fate suffered by Jesus, whom we worship today. And the same happened to the brave French girl, Joan of Arc, whose bravery was rewarded by burning her alive. And today, she is one of the most celebrated saint girl of the France. I am also reminded of Socrates, who was condemned for his way and spoiled the youth. And today, his theories and philosophies are a course study for the youth. So if it had to happen to all the great men of the world, Baba Sahib was obviously no exception. He faced the worst opposition and condemnation, and today we are celebrating his once upon a time existence and ideology. This thought really makes me feel sad and defeated sometimes. Such a contribution of this great personality to the cause of the people, that his 125th birth anniversary is being celebrated globally by the people all of nationality. This is a proud moment for all and wonderful tribute to the father of Indian Constitution by the global brethren. That is probably the reason that Ambedkar was voted the greatest man in 2011 by the poll organized by the History TV 18 and CNN, IBN. Nearly 20 million votes were cast, making him the most popular Indian figure since the last of the initiator. And what I say about the noble laureate Amartya Sen, who said that Ambedkar is father of my economics. His contribution in the field of economics is marvelous and will be remembered forever. Friends, Baba Sahib, Dr. Ambedkar is one name which chokes our hearts and with emotion and fills our heads with gratitude despite having option to lead a comfortable life. He chose to lead a modest way of living and to work for the cause of oppressed and depressed classes and find lasting solution to the long vexed social problem of the world. The societal adversities and hardship back home could never lower the resolve of Baba Sahib. At the times, he was misunderstood and attempts were made to grossly misinterpret him. But he never changed his course and kept going with the flow as if he was aware that this is the fate suffered by all great men who have endeavored to change the course of the history. But friends, his critics never knew that we cannot hurt a mountain by throwing a stone at it. For a person with resolve as well as a mountain, this was a futile attempt by vain men with ill-digested understanding. Friends, I would like to share a very touching incident of Baba Sahib's life. He was the first law minister of our country, and despite having the luxuries and comfortables at his disposal, he gave the perfect example of his die-hard honesty and strong integrity. He led a very modest life. So modest that his first son died of illness for which Baba Sahib could not afford treatment due to the capacity of funds. The fate kept playing its game with Baba Sahib, and when his second son fell ill, there was no money to get him medicine, and eventually he also died. His position became worse when he could not afford a yard and a quarter of cloth to wrap the corpse of his son. He was offered money by his well-wishers, but he refused. What he accepted was a part of the sari that his wife tore from her one she was wearing to cover the crops of their beloved son. Friend, this is just one incident out of life of great saint, and if we go any further and peep deeper, we would all burst into tears. The uniqueness of Ambedkar's, that is why any description of the man of stature as high as Baba Sahib would never be adequate. So every word I say and every effort I make to pay my fondest tribute to this extraordinary visionary, I am sure would not be apt and sufficient. So only I can afford to say in the praise of Baba Sahib is that he was a man of unique personality, who not only formulated ideals, but was also of such a character who could achieve them too. His life is a learning for all the generations bygone, present, and future. The uniqueness of Ambedkar's thinking is such that its relevance has not diminished even a bit with the passage of time. Even today, when we are faced with any challenge, his thoughts come handy to understand and analyze the socio-political problem of our time. This is the real test of a visionary, that his views must survive long after life snuffs out of him. I extend my profound wishes and heartily congratulate one and all on the 125th birth anniversary of Baba Sahib. I believe Baba Sahab's lifelong struggle for equality was not only for the people of India, but for the people around the globe. Therefore, I propose before this august house gathering here and dignitaries that Baba Sahib's birthday, that is 14th April, may be declared as the International Equality Day by the United Nations. Which would be true tribute and honor for Baba Sahib, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar ji. I hope from here we will take intellectually stimulating ideas to create political revitalisms and social regeneration for which Baba Sahib lived and laid down his life. Mahatma Gandhi has rightly remarked, Ambedkar is not a man to allow himself to be forgotten. May he always live in the hearts of millions for all the times to come. Jai Bheem, Jai Bharat. Thanks you all.